Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you Rinya for organizing this panel and inviting me to submit a paper. And thank you all for attending my talk. I also need to apologize quickly to anyone who's here to listen about group interaction, but I've had to bracket that part of my presentation because of Hong Kong's social distancing laws. I hope you'll understand, or because maybe I'm one of those presenters that Christoph Hafner referred to in his opening as novice. But fortunately, Tanya just covered some information about group interaction. I also want to let you know that before I studied gesture, I was actually a lifeguard on the beach. I'm not saying that to show off. There is a relevant point here, and that is that we had to qualify, and every year we had to do a refresher course in first aid training. And it was just a one-day course. And the course revolved around CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is basically chest compressions and mouth to mouth, which would be difficult with a face mask, I'm now realizing. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it always struck me that we were being trained in something that we very rarely needed to do. And I think that's, you know, we would, mostly on the beach, you're dealing with sprained ankles, insect bites, wasp stings, jellyfish problems, and sunburn. And I think this is relevant to gesture and assessed speaking activities, because when I look at the way that gesture is integrated to different syllabi, I'm sometimes struck by that same feeling that students might be being assessed on things that, although important, might not be the most central or useful to the everyday business of presenting and interacting in groups. Now, one day on the beach, my colleagues did have to do CPR, and I'll save that story for the end if there's time. Just like the lifeguard training, students are expected to do certain things and assessed on those. There are also things that we see them do in the classroom data, just like Tanya was showing. And then we have studies of skilled practitioners, for example, presenting in TED Talks and so on. So we could have a look at some of that research and then conclude. Assessment criteria, I'm just going to focus on the oral presentation activity that's assessed on the Hong Kong DSE. That's the secondary school exit examination in English language, where they have to give a presentation. And as you can see, there are 4 criteria: pronunciation and delivery, communication strategies, vocabulary and language patterns, and body language appears as a communication strategy. And it's not defined anywhere in this handbook for teachers, but you can see that high-scoring students are expected to use appropriate body language to show focus on audience and to engage interest. One of the researchers at Hong Kong University who contributed to the design of this activity was Davison, and she's defined body language as gaze, facial expressions, head movement, and body direction. It's interesting that she doesn't include gesture there. I imagine that's maybe just, I mean, I think she assumes or implies it there. She also says that the more, sorry, I can't read that. Okay, so that was just a brief example of the criteria on which students giving oral presentations are assessed. And you can see that gesture was a communication skill. In other kinds of criteria, you might find it as a delivery skill. So communication strategies or delivery skills. And studies of speaking activities that take place in classrooms that are either assessed or part of training students, I'll just divide them here into 2 kinds. There are those of assessed expository speeches for foreign language classes, and they tend to focus on the forms and functions of gestures, at least the ones that I've come across here. And then you have more academic presentations by junior scholars from the perspective of multimodal discourse analysis. So here would be an example of a study into gesture that has recommendations for teaching and learning about what gestures can and can't be taught. So this researcher, Busa, she observed that her Italian students of English sometimes perform gestures that could be glossed as once upon a time and what do you mean? Here they're shown. And she thought that these would be misunderstood by what she called native English speakers because they're culturally specific emblems to Italy, she said. And indeed, she showed them to a panel of students from America. And she found that they were misunderstood 31% and 68% of the time. And she taught her students about the cultural specificity of certain gestures and reduced the amount of those gestures they were performing and at the end of the course, she said her students had acquired awareness of the differences in cross-cultural gestural behavior. So basically, they stopped performing their emblems. Now, Tabensky, in a chapter of a very comprehensive guide to second language acquisition and gesture, published by McCafferty and Stam, that's Gail Stam on this panel, Tabensky analysed 5 to 10 minute exposés of her Australian students learning French and observed that there were two main types of gestures that were occurring, presentational and representational. The presentational ones are like the palm up gesture, and the representational ones I've illustrated here as kind of an iconic gesture where the gesture form reflects something about what the speaker is saying. And here the speaker is saying running around with guns, and he's got his hand in a gun carry position. And Tabensky found the relative frequency of these gesture types to be influenced by the spontaneity of the discourse, the style of the speaker, and the level of language proficiency. But Tabensky, unlike Buser, argued that gestures are individual spontaneous actions, and therefore said that for her, trying to coach students on which gestures to perform would be simply unthinkable. There we go. Okay, now Carney built on the studies by Tabensky and Buser and wanted to see if those kind of more spontaneous gestures could be taught. And for his students in Japan who were learning how to give presentations in English, he taught them about the presentational gestures, and he also taught them about pointing to the slides. In subsequent presentations from his students, they all increased the quantity of their gestures. And Carney said that some of these gestures represented what a native English speaker might do, like a circling movement with the phrase all year round, but others appeared confusing and dissonant. Okay, I just want to pause for a moment here. These three studies help to build a picture of how gesture is being analysed and assessed in speaking activities, and the kind of recommendations or implications. So, you know, we could teach our students about these culturally specific emblems, like Buser did, but Buser's students were from Italy, and that's got a notoriously wide vocabulary of these emblems, right? The similar presentations by Japanese and Australian students studied by Tabensky and Carney didn't mention this type of gesture or this type of problem. And the assessment criteria I began with didn't either, although it did say appropriate gestures, and maybe that's implied there. But Carney explicitly taught his Japanese students that the expression a long time ago might be represented by one arm with an open hand motioning backwards. So it's not exactly clear which emblems are culturally specific or shared. At least there is disagreement among these researchers here. Teaching students about the cultural specificity of their own gestures, it might enable them to avoid a kind of faux pas, but I'm not sure how serious of a problem that would cause or how often that happens. And it's also to assume that we can know the cultural backgrounds of the audiences to which our students will one day present, which is increasingly unlikely. Okay, what about these studies of novice academic presenters? You know, the kinds that have to cut half of their presentation out before they begin. Well, this study by Morel, Garcia, and Sanchez, it's based on a course that they've designed in teaching students about multimodality. So in the first part of the course, they actually tell their students about multimodal presentation genre, and they give them strategies for successful performance, whereas part 2 allows them to practice, and they're peer reviewed, and the researchers also analyze those presentations. In that first part of the course, they ask the students, what modes will the message take into account? What verbal and non-verbal connections may be made to go from one point or another? And then they ask them to work in groups of related fields, physics, chemistry, to come up with the rules of thumb, visual tactics, and 10 steps to follow in the carrying out of a successful presentation. When the presentations happen, they give the students these peer review grids, and you can see that as part of the grid, they have to analyze the modes that their peers are using to present. And you can see that they have to say whether modes are used, yes or no, as whether the modes are used appropriate, effectively, or good. And then in their own analysis, the multimodal analysis of those students' presentations, they present a situation like this, where they try to show that there's a predominant mode for each of the speakers. For example, speaker 3 at the top there, it's spoken and image at minute 2, spoken at 4, spoken at 6. So that student there was predominantly a spoken one. And they also try and show the sequencing of modes, whether it's simultaneous or consecutive. Yeah. And this research is their main basis, or the basis of their main pedagogical implication, which is courses to aid non-native English-speaking academics should emphasize the use of multimodality. Okay. Now, rather than seeing gesture and multimodality as a kind of communication strategy or delivery skill, there's some other research I've come across in performance studies, which really emphasizes the intimate connections between the speaker and their environment, which haven't really been touched on so far by the studies I reviewed. So research in performance studies by Knockblau indicates the intimacy with which presenters may interact with their visuals is a property of the technology they're using. He says, insofar as they use such equipment, whatever speakers may be understood, whatever speakers say may be understood as relating to whatever they show. So in other words, the combination of modes or the configuration of a spoken and a slide is always already there beforehand. As soon as you stand up in front of one of these slides, you will be perceived as related to it, and the things you say will be interpreted as related to it. And he has these really nice analyses of how presenters use their laser pointer on the slide to what is otherwise a static visual. By moving the laser pointer, they animate that visual and bring out its semantic features. So taking inspiration by that work, perspectives on embodied interaction come in relevant here, like the enactive approach or ecological psychology, because here we find person-environment relations as an ongoing dynamic in which people and their material and social environment are fundamentally entangled and continuously interact without the need for a strategy or a particular combination or configuration. So microethnographer Jürgen Streeck, for example, who's keynote at the conference and will give the plenary tomorrow morning, has established why meaning does not inhere in these forms, but is a relationship between form and context. And in his studies of the garage auto mechanic, which we might see tomorrow, he showed that each moment of understanding is the result of a local montage of heterogeneous resources. So I've tried to build on this research and bring his notion of showing, which is an embodied practice that's fundamentally environmentally embedded and socially implicative, into the realm of oral presentations with the stage work of Professor Brian Cox, who's a physicist and gives amazing presentations where his speech, his gestures, the slide, and the audience are continually interacting in a dynamic. And I'm afraid that I'm going to have to leave those videos of Professor Brian Cox for you to discover on your own time. But I will just mention one quote by Ingold that points to a different understanding, I think, of skilled practice that's relevant to presentations. that a skilled practitioner is one who can continually attune his or her movements to perturbations in the perceived environment without ever interrupting the flow of action. And I think that notions of attunement, movement, perturbation, perception, and flow are interesting to consider or to operationalize maybe for assessment purposes, but there's a lot of work to do there. So I just want to ask, is it a priority to assess gesture with normative notions like appropriate, to teach about the forms and functions of gestures, to ask our students to dissect the genre into different modes, then identify ways that modes can be sequenced or combined into effective strategies? Or could this potentially, when we take into account multimodality research of many different stripes, actually over-determine the nature of multimodality and process the harmonious ecology of an oral presentation through a scientific ontology? Would adopting a more fundamentally relational view lead students to deeper understanding and better presentations? However, these questions are for future research and for LSPP 7. Oh, and that day, my lifeguard colleagues had to perform CPR was not because someone drowned in their swim zone, but because someone was struck by lightning in the beach car park. So no amount of training could have prepared them for that. Thank you very much.